right. Yeah, so I was supposed to be here last month, and the night of the meetup, I returned home from the hospital with my fiance and a newborn son. And before we get into JavaScript, I thought I would pass on some advice about baby pictures and new parents. So, New York, there's no shortage of delis or grocery stores, and you go into a grocery store or a deli, and you notice that they really do a good job of lighting up the food. They also do a really good job of lighting up babies. They're really lighting this thing, man. I mean, you could pass this off as kind of a studio shot if it wasn't for the babies.
A little bit louder, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, this is the back.
Sure, this is my baby. And a good way to photograph babies is take them to the deli. So I'm Vince Allen. I'm a software engineering manager at Spotify, and you can get in touch with me on Twitter. And all the code for the examples in this talk can be found at this repo. And I'm going to be talking about taking natural simulations running in a web browser and converting them to HD video. And I'm going to show you what I mean by a natural simulation. I've been spending like a year or two really studying how to render a natural simulation in a web browser, and I was inspired by this guy, Valentino Bradenberg. So Valentino Bradenberg was an Italian neuroscientist, and in the 1960s he was studying how human beings developed intelligence and reasoning. And he started really simple with like insect brains and so on. And by the 1970s, he'd written this book. And this book imagines 10 hypothetical vehicles, all with sensors. And as they progress through the book, the sensors start to increase in complexity. And at some point, the vehicles start to exhibit behavior that, like, as human beings, we identify with and almost associate with emotion. So let me show you what I mean. Do I have my mouse? That is huge. So this is a really simple simulation. This little vehicle has two sensors, one for cold, one for heat. And when it's around heat, it speeds up. When it's around cold, it slows down. And a more advanced example, this little guy has 4 sensors, and he's attracted to food and oxygen and consumes them, and he's aggressive toward light and speeds up around heat. And the whole point of the book really is that there's this threshold that as observers, we start to accept that this is something that could be in nature. This is something that looks very natural and exhibits some type of intelligence. But there's a paradox in this, because we designed the vehicle. We know it's just a collection of simple rules. So I've been inspired by projects like NodeBots, right, where we're using JavaScript as a creative tool to create something outside of the browser. And when I was rendering these things, I thought it'd be really interesting to do this as video. You know, why should I always have to present this as something in a browser, you know, at runtime? So I'm going to talk about how I got there, and it's a 2-step process. So first, I did a lot, at some point in my life, I did a lot of this post-it pixel art stuff, you know, on the wall. And I thought about it, and I was like, there's a solution here. And the solution really is to use the browser equivalent of a post-it note, and that's a CSS box shadow. So I want you to imagine this is a browser window, and we've created a grid, and each square is 32 pixels by 32 pixels. And I can put a DOM element up at the top left, and I can hide that DOM element if I make the width and height 0, right? So I can make it go away. And it's still there, and what's really cool about box shadows is I can still cast a shadow from an invisible DOM element, right? And even better, I can cast as many as I want. And what's really great about box shadows is they have these nice properties. So 2D location. They have a blur value, which is really interesting. They also have a spread property, which is essentially a scale value. And they have RGB and HSL color and opacity, right? So what's really cool then is I can take multiple box shadows, assign different properties, and create shapes, and so on. Even better though, I can add an animation loop. And at that point, that one div, that one DOM element, has now become a little mini rendering engine. And so I'll show you what I mean. So this is a box shadow, right? It just sits here, does nothing, but we start updating the properties in an animation loop when we have a bouncing box shadow, okay? Now the real payoff to this whole thing is when you throw 1,000 box shadows into your simulation. And this is really nice because I'm running at 60 frames per second and animating 1,000 things, and this is just pure DOM, right? I'm not doing anything with Flash or Java or WebGL or whatever. So I mentioned a blur property. So now I'm mapping velocity to blur, and then the faster they go, the more blur they have. So now I've got kind of this cheap motion blur, only using JavaScript and CSS. If I then do this with a simulation, this is a flocking simulation. So now this is something like 100 box shadows all flocking together, and I've mapped velocity to blur, and I'm using HSL color here and mapping luminosity to velocity so they light up a little bit as they swarm around and so on. So to really kind of show off the blur, emphasize it, you can do something like this, right? So these guys are just moving across the screen. We've got 150 of them. It's still at 60 frames per second, and I have this kind of like cool blur thing going on. So while this is all running in the DOM, it's in the browser, how do we get this to video though, right? So we're going to do two things. We're going to use Photoshop, and we're going to use Node. So with the 14.1 release of Photoshop, they released Adobe Generator, which is a Node app that allows you to script, to automate tasks in Photoshop. And you can actually script your own plugins. And so when you spin up Adobe Generator, it'll also spin up your plugins, and they're available in the menu. And so essentially what I did was capture all the objects in every frame and all their properties, pass them off to Adobe Generator, had Photoshop rendered all the frames just automatically, and then I could dump it out to HD video. This is Vimeo. So let's see what that looks like. So now the motion blur is actually accurate. The blurring is blurring in the direction that the objects are traveling. There's also a Gaussian blur applied, so we have some nice depth, gives it a nice watery effect. Now, we're not rendering an HD video here. This is 800 by 600, but you can go to Vimeo and check it out. So then the next piece, so what's cool about doing this outside the browser is you're not bounded in terms of frame rate, right? I can add as many DOM elements as I want, and so now I've doubled the amount of objects that you saw in the previous example that is running in the browser. Yeah. And the motion blur, of course, is actually accurate. All right, so again, how did I do this? Photoshop, 14.1 and higher. This repo that you kind of can't see. So when you clone that repo, right, when you clone Generator 4, this is what you get. And here's all your plugins, right? And you just fire it up like any Node app. This is Photoshop before, and this is Photoshop after. You can't quite tell, but we've got a bunch of plugins that we've scripted. And you script a plugin basically using this structure, right? You've got a project name, and when Generator fires up your plugin, it passes an instance of itself into your init function. Then you can add a menu item, right? So my project name gets added to the menu, and I can add an event so that when I click it, I can fire off a function. And essentially, I'm taking my JavaScript, passing it as a string to this magic Adobe JavaScript function that then will execute what I want. If you want to see what Adobe JavaScript looks like, it's in the URL is way too long. Just search for Photoshop JavaScript script elements. Anyway, what's really fun about doing this as a Node app as well is that I have access to other APIs, as I'm rendering, right? And so for every 50 or 100th frame, I can spit it out to Twitter. And so I can check on the progress of this thing. If you go to bShadow Machine on Twitter, then you can actually see these frames in progress. So if you're interested in doing this and checking out more about it, you can go to bitshadowmachine.com. This is a generator, and you can check the videos in True HD on yeah. There you go.